Welcome back. And thanks for sticking with us here at Live Now from Fox. I'm your host, Carel Lajara. Let's get to some more political headlines. A look outside there at the White House in Washington, D.C. And I do want to take a look ahead to next week because this Tuesday, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz will be participating in the only debate scheduled between the two candidates this cycle. The 90-minute debate is scheduled for 9 p.m. Eastern and will be moderated by CBS Evening News anchor Noah O'Donnell and Face the Nation host Margaret Brennan. CBS News says it will be up to Vance and Walz to fact-check each other during that debate. And I want to get into all of this with political analyst here, Rich Rubino. Rich, good to see you as always. And I think my first question would have to be, what comes to mind when you hear that Vance and Walz are going to have to fact-check each other during that debate? And do you think they can do that accurately?
No, you have to essentially, there's probably some level of truth to it. There's very rarely does a presidential or any candidate say something that's an outright categorical falsehood, but usually there's some sort of a half truth to it or a technical truth to it. So that's where the media as a gatekeeper, that's where their job comes in. And they have to say essentially whether what they person said was true, what more there is to it. And usually it's probably somewhere the truth is his side, it's his side, and then the truth is somewhere in the middle.
All right, I know that you are a big presidential political historian here, so I have to ask you also, Rich, thinking about the fact that this is the only debate scheduled between both of these vice presidential candidates, in recent memory in the past, has any VP debate really stood out to you, and why?
Yes, and it's actually the first one was 1976, and that was actually between so the Democrats that year. Jimmy Carter won the Democratic presidential nomination. He was an outsider, a one-term governor of Georgia. His vice presidential running mate was Walter Mondale, who's very much a political insider, and he was a senator from Minnesota. On the Republican side, Gerald Ford, actually Nelson Rockefeller was vice president. Ford dumped Rockefeller and put on Bob Dole, who was seen as more of a tribune of the conservative bloodline of the Republican Party. They did their debate, and Bob Dole in that debate essentially accused Walter Mondale of being in the Democratic Party, which was responsible for all the wars since World War II. Later, he had to kind of backtrack, and others would say that these really had bipartisan support, whether it was World War II, Korea, or Vietnam. But he made that statement, and he had to kind of backtrack that. So that's the one that really stands out. And the other one is 1988, and this is the one you're going to hear about a lot of a litany of times between now and Tuesday. So Lloyd Bentsen was a senator from Texas who had been in there since 1948. Dan Quayle was a senator from Indiana who was only 43 years old. And at the time, the issue was coming up about the age issue and the experience issue. And Dan Quayle basically said, I have as much experience since John F. Kennedy did when he was elected president at 43 years old in 1962. To which Lloyd Bentsen looks at the senator and says, Senator, I knew Jack Kennedy. I served with Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. And Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy. Then Dan Quayle says that was uncalled for, Senator, but that was really, he won the debate with that. And the ironic thing was that while Senator Bentsen and John F. Kennedy were colleagues, they really weren't friends and they barely even really knew each other.
Rich, we have seen two other debates this election cycle. The first one between Biden and Trump, most infamously there, Biden dropping out of the race right after that first debate. Then we saw the debate between Trump and Harris. What do you think Walz and Vance can take away from those debates? What can they learn from?
Well, I think it's obviously it's a different animal because in both cases you're dealing with two completely different people. And Tim Walz, you're dealing with somebody who's a governor, and you didn't have that on the other side. On the case of J.D. Vance, you're dealing with somebody who's basically an author, somewhat of an intellectual, who ran for the United States Senate and was really just elected in 2022. You can go over their programs, and I think certainly Tim Walz will try to kind of ignore J.D. Vance to a certain extent and try to run against Donald Trump, more or less, talking about some of Trump's conspiracy theories, talking about him being a threat to democracy. J.D. Vance will come back and talk about Biden inflation. So it will really be a case of two surrogates kind of running against each other. But I think what they're really doing and is they're probably looking at past debates that the candidates have had. And in this case, they were both up for election in 2022. Tim Walz defeated a state senator from named Scott Jensen, who had been elected in 2016 to the state Senate, served just 2 terms, ran for governor against him. And there are some very similar issues that had come up during that debate. For example, conspiracy theories and I think that Tim Walz really kind of took him on that. In the case of J.D. Vance, first of all, he had primary debates, and he won the primary with Donald Trump's support. And then in the general election, he went on and had a very formidable opponent in Congressman Tim Ryan from Youngstown, Ohio. You should watch all those debates. I think you really can learn about the different debating skills from that more so than watching the presidential candidates debate each other.
Okay, I'm going to piggyback off of that answer. Let's talk about the debate skills that each of them are bringing them to the table here. Let's start with Vance, who was the first VP nomination that we heard from this election cycle.
Yeah, JD Vance is a very good debater. He was able to come out of really obscurity to a certain extent. He ran for his first office in 2022. If you go back and you can look at some of the C-SPAN archives for the Republican primary, he was a very efficacious debater. He's very good at that. He's very good on his feet. He's very good. The one thing that I think where he's differentiating himself from his Republican opponents was when it comes to the war in the Ukraine. And he basically said that he doesn't really necessarily that it's not one of his top priorities who wins the war between the Ukraine and Russia. This gave him kind of the candidate of the non-interventionist bloodline in the Republican Party. So I think that he's very good in that respect. In terms of Tim Walz, he's very good at explaining something, and he's very good at kind of taking down an opponent. He can find the intricacies of his opponent's policies, and also he was very good at defending himself. In one case, Scott Jensen was arguing against him, for example, the way that he had handled the riots in Minneapolis, and during the 2020 during the protests. And Tim Walz was very good at kind of coming back and defending them. Also, there was a couple of scandals involving lower level members of the Walz administration. Is very good at defending that as well. So I think that but I think at the end of the day, these are 2 very good debaters, and it could very well be what most vice presidential debates, for example, to the 2000 debate between Dick Cheney and Joe Lieberman is. If you can remember one thing about that debate, you're very impressive, because this will probably be a subservient debate to, I think, the presidential debate.
Rich, I do not remember that debate, but that's why I have you here, so that you can remind us exactly what went down there. Speaking
it was fascinating.
I'm sure, and we get the full scope with you, Rich Rubino, here. Speaking of you following, of course, all of the politics throughout the decades, no shortage of headlines coming out this election cycle. What do you think is for sure going to be talked about on this debate this Tuesday?
A bunch of things. One of them will certainly be immigration. J.D. Vance has really made it his flagship issue about the issue of immigration. He recently said that it's the most important issue, and he basically said a close second is the fact that young Americans can't accomplish the American dream. So he's really going to bring that, and he's going to say essentially that when Vice President Harris took over the vice presidency, she indicated she supported policies that were antithetical to securing the border. I think that's an issue she's certainly going to take on. I think you're going to hear the term Biden inflation. I think he's going to bring that up. And I also think that J.D. Vance is kind of in the sui generis position here, in that he is a different type of a Republican. He's more of a populist, and he's more of somebody who I think tries to present themselves as favorable to labor. Therefore, he can essentially go after, for example, free trade deals and talk about free trade deals like NAFTA that Joe Biden had supported. He can talk about the role of multinational corporations. That's not a traditional Republican issue, but I think it's something that he would certainly bring up. And on the other side, contrary-wise, I think that Tim Walz will try to present himself in a way that Democrats have not really had an image since basically Bill Clinton in 1992. Somebody who's a hunter, somebody who was an assistant football coach, somebody who kind of came from a more conservative part of the country, Nebraska, represented a center-right congressional district in southern Minnesota. I think he's going to try to present himself as so it's going to be a different type of Republican against a different type of Democrat.
Rich, I think it's also worth reminding our viewers kind of the role of a vice president and what is ideal when trying to fill those shoes, if you can explain.
Yep. The vice president, constitutionally, they have very few responsibilities. They're supposed to preside over the United States Senate. They don't actually do that. It's usually they give it to the Senate pro tem, who's the most senior member of who's usually the most senior member of the United States Senate in the majority party. That person then usually has younger senators or some of the more recently elected senators presiding over the Senate. The only time they're really there in terms of presiding over the Senate is when there's going to be a tie-breaking vote. Vice President Harris has actually had more tie-breaking votes than any United States Senate in American history because the Senate is so bifurcated. Beyond that, I mean, a lot of it is what the president puts the vice president, what role the president gives the vice president. It used to be a very much of a ceremonial role. Richard Johnson, for example, who was Martin Van Buren's vice president from 1837 to 1841, actually spent 6 months to go home to Kentucky to open up a tavern and spa. He went and took a leave of absence. Now, you can't imagine that happening today, but it did happen at one time. You have some of the more obscure vice presidents who had a very small role in the administration, whether it was William Wheeler and Rutherford B. Hayes' administration or Garrett Hobart and William McKinley's administration. It was really Jimmy Carter who gave Walter Mondale, though, an office in the West Wing and made him an integral part of the administration. And since then, every administration has basically tried to copy that model. Today, you hear the president often gives the vice president many roles. Al Gore, for example, had the role of being responsible for reinventing government program under the Clinton administration. George H.W. Bush trusted Dan Quayle with to meet with many foreign dignitaries. So it's really what the president makes of it. But obviously, the president's health, this is the vice president constitutionally, is the person next in line.
Rich, we spoke a little bit about the strengths that each of these candidates bring to the table ahead of this debate. What are some of the weaknesses that you think that each candidate is going to pick off from their opponent?
I think in the case of J.D. Vance, if he takes on his opponent directly as opposed to just ignoring him and taking on Joe Biden, he might take on some of the riots that occurred in Minnesota after the police shooting, for example, and say that he was not effective in trying to curtail them. I think in the case of Governor Vance, there's not much of a Senate record for him to take on J.D. Vance for certain votes. He could certainly talk about misvotes, that type of thing. He could say that he's trying to somebody who's really a labor baiting United States senator who's trying to present himself as somebody who's very pro-labor. So that's what I think that both sides are going to try to do. I think that, but for the most part, I think 90% of it is going to be either presenting themselves in a positive way or trying to excoriate the presidential candidate.
Finally, Rich, what are you most looking forward to when watching this debate coming up on Tuesday?
I think it's just that. I think these two candidates are so well prepared, and I think that they've watched previous debates from both candidates. It's going to be absolutely really fascinating to see how they decide to use what they've learned and whether they were going to be able to it. It could be that each candidate is so thin-skinned that one of them starts attacking them, they start going after something, it could become something completely different. We really don't know. They're kind of a tabula rasa at the national level, but they've obviously debated at the state level. So my guess is that both candidates are watching previous debates really ad nauseum. And I think that they're very nervous right now. I think Tim Walz has even admitted that he's somewhat nervous because they're really two people who are generally new to the national political scene. A year ago, very few people outside of Minnesota heard of Tim Walz, other than many movie buffs, very few, or perhaps people that knew him from his author history. Very few people knew of who J.D. Vance was, but obviously there are people that they get this one chance to debate. And Richard Nixon used to say about the vice presidency, the number one role is do no harm. And that's what they have to do. They may not necessarily win the debate the way Lloyd Bentsen did, but they at least don't have to do harm the way Bob Dole did back in 1976.
1976. My goodness. All right. Rich Rubino, political analyst here. Love dissecting all of these political headlines with you. And of course, it could be exciting what we see happening Tuesday. So we look forward to checking in with you after that debate this Tuesday. Thank you.
Can't wait. It's going to be absolutely fascinating.
Of course. You take care, Rich. We'll talk soon.
Thank you so much.
Of course, and I do want to just let all of our viewers know that this vice presidential debate happening October 1st. So it's set to start at 9 p.m. Eastern time, but make sure you tune in with us here at Live Now from Fox because we have live coverage with a pre-debate show starting at 8 p.m. Eastern. We'll be right back.